The internet's been restored in Tanzania after a several-day shutdown, after protests following the re-election of the country's president, Samia Suluhu Hassan. She's insisted the election was free and fair after being declared to have won 98% of the vote. People in Tanzania have been sharing images of dead bodies strewn on the streets after the violence that came after the election last week. She has blamed outsiders for the unrest that followed the election. Opposition parties claim hundreds of people died during.
Excellencies, as we are all aware, DRC, a member of both the EAC and SADC, is still facing prolonged conflicts whose impact has transcended its borders and so creating far-reaching effects in neighboring countries. For the last couple of weeks, we have witnessed the spread of violence that has caused massive harm to human life, human displacement and insecurity, which affected economic activities and disrupted cross-border trades. As regional leaders, history will judge us harshly if we remain still and watch the situation worsen day by day. And in line with the principle of African solutions for Africa's problems, our countries have a collective responsibility to ensure we urgently address the existing security challenges that have heavily impacted the well-being of innocent civilians. This joint summit meeting presents an opportunity to recommit our collective efforts in addressing the conflicts and reaffirm our sustainable peace and stability in the entire EAC and SADC regions.
So we have to stop pretending that countries that just hold an election where sometimes the winner somehow magically gets 90% of the vote because all the opposition is locked up or can't get on TV is a democracy. Democracy depends on strong institutions, and it's about minority rights and checks and balances and freedom of speech and freedom of expression and a free press and the right to protest and petition the government and an independent judiciary and everybody having to follow the law.
In Tanzania, the opposition says that security forces secretly dumped the bodies of hundreds killed in post-election protests. Human Rights Watch condemned the crackdown and urged accountability.
The Tanzanian government faced mounting concern over killings during and after last week's election, with the largest opposition party charging on Tuesday that the security forces were secretly dumping the bodies of hundreds killed in the crackdown. A spokesperson for the main opposition Chadema party challenged the authorities to take responsibility for the killings.
Chadema and
the African Union Observer's mission on the just concluded and disputed elections in Tanzania reveals how the elections were manipulated into a resounding Samia Suluhu victory. The Observer's report indicates cases of ballot stuffing, internet blackouts and abductions, and how they compromised the integrity of the elections.
Naapa kwamba nitakuwa mwaminifu kwa Jamhuri ya Muungano wa Tanzania. Nitaihifadhi, nitailinda na
for stability and progress is now at the center of one of the deadliest political uprisings in East Africa's modern history. Over 700 citizens are feared dead, hundreds more missing, and the streets of Dar es Salaam, Dodoma, and Arusha are on fire. The internet is down, social media blocked.
With Tanzania, and the Tanzanian government is calling for talks with the opposition following the deadly post-election violence that gripped the country, with human rights groups voicing concern over the state of human rights and governance in East Africa's largest country. This comes a day after the arrest of Chadema Secretary General Amani Golugwa, as a crackdown on those suspected to have participated in the post-election protests intensifies.
2025. A Tanzania Air Force weapons instructor sat before a camera and did what no soldier in his country had dared to do in 60 years. He looked directly into the lens and told his nation, "Your government is stealing from you. If we don't stop them now, this nation will collapse." Within 48 hours, Captain John Charles Tesha had vanished. discharged.
Samia Suluhu Hassan, the winner, declared 97% support. That's like North Korea. Is there still democracy in Tanzania?
It's not for me to judge Tanzania. It is...
it seems a bit fishy, 97%, doesn't it?
Well, in a democracy, for example, in Kenya, you can never get 96%.
So it's not a
democracy. Where authorities have imposed curfews and an internet blackout as post-election protests sweep the country. Demonstrators have clashed with police in several cities following Wednesday's general election. They say the result is unfair after the president's main challengers were excluded from the ballot. The internet blackout is raising concerns about the ability to get reliable information about what's actually happening.
As the first female president in the history of my country, the burden of expectation to deliver gender equality is heavier on my shoulders. It is for this reason that I commend the initiative by the UN Women, France and Mexico to organize the Generation Equality Forum that took place in Paris in June this year, whereby my country volunteered to champion for women's economic rights and justice. Aware that being passionate about gender equality is not sufficient, my government is reviewing policy and legal frameworks in order to come up with actionable and measurable plans to ensure economic empowerment of women, but also other aspects pertaining to gender equality and gender parity.
When President Asham Wen took office, few in Washington paid attention. She wasn't born into power, she wasn't a Western-trained technocrat, and she wasn't supposed to matter. But within 3 years, this quiet-spoken, steel-eyed Tanzanian leader became the single most disruptive political force Africa had seen in decades, a woman whose ideas rattled embassies, shook oil markets, and forced the White House into emergency meetings. The world called her the Iron Lady of Africa, but in Tanzania, she had another name, Mama Taifa, the mother of the nation. Asham Wen's rise began after a stormy election that international media dismissed as routine. But Tanzania had changed. Young voters, weary of poverty and corruption, wanted someone who would speak to their pride, not their pain. Mwende, a former educator turned economist, promised one thing: economic sovereignty. "We will no longer sell gold for pennies," she declared in her first speech. "We will not trade our land for loans, and we will never again be told how to grow by those who never planted." Her words were poetry to Africans and poison to Washington. Within months, Mwende canceled several Western-backed mining contracts, arguing that foreign corporations had siphoned wealth while leaving Tanzanians poor. She nationalized 2 gold refineries, imposed export caps, and banned the export of unprocessed minerals. The U.S. called it economic isolationism. Tanzanians called it justice. In Dar es Salaam, life changed fast. Factories reopened under government cooperatives. Women in rural villages began receiving direct dividends from new agricultural programs. Mwende slashed ministerial salaries, including her own, and poured funds into schools, roads, and the national grid. She introduced the African Value Tax, a 15% tariff on any foreign company extracting Tanzanian resources without local processing. The move triggered outrage in Washington and London. The U.S. Treasury labeled Tanzania a trade risk. Mwende responded with a smile and a proverb: "You cannot call a lion dangerous for protecting its cubs." Within 6 months, Tanzania's GDP rose 8%. The East African nation had become a laboratory for economic defiance, a model of what could happen if Africa refused to play by Western rules. Then came the spark that made her a global symbol, when an American oil company refused to comply with new local ownership laws. Mwende revoked its drilling license. Live on television. "Tanzania's soil is not a donation," she said as the cameras rolled. Washington was furious. The U.S. State Department issued a statement condemning her anti-business policies. Western investors fled, predicting collapse. But China, India, and the Gulf states flooded in with offers. The collapse never came. Instead, Tanzania surged. Mwende's next move terrified Washington even more. She signed the African Resource Unity Pact, a bold agreement with Kenya, Uganda, and Zambia to collectively regulate the export of strategic minerals like cobalt, lithium, and nickel. The pact established a unified price floor, ensuring no Western company could play one African nation against another. The day the ARUP was announced, stock prices of 3 major U.S. tech giants plunged by billions. The message was clear: Africa was done being cheap. For decades, Mwen told reporters, they said Africa is rich in resources but poor in management. I say Africa was never poor, it was just too generous. Her voice carried across the continent like a drumbeat. In Nairobi, students painted murals of her with the words, "One woman, one continent." In Lagos, newspapers called her the president who said no. In Accra, rallies echoed her slogan, "Our resources, our rules." Behind closed doors, Washington strategists debated how to contain her influence. A leaked memo from the National Security Council titled Mwen Doctrine, a threat to Western economic interests, described her policies as dangerous to the stability of dollar-based trade. The CIA, according to insiders, began monitoring political developments in Tanzania closely. But Mwen was untouchable. She didn't hide, she didn't beg, and most importantly, she didn't borrow. Her economic independence soon turned into political audacity. At the African Union summit, she took the stage and, without naming names, tore into the hypocrisy of global diplomacy. When they give loans, they call it development. When we invest in each other, they call it debt. When they exploit our labor, it's trade. When we demand fair value, it's aggression. The hall erupted in applause. Western diplomats left early, their faces stone cold. The next morning, an editorial in the Washington Post read, "Tanzania's leader turns Africa against the West." But by then, it was too late. Africa was listening. Under Mwen's guidance, Tanzania deepened. "'Tis with the BRICS bloc." She signed infrastructure and energy deals with China and India, joining their digital currency trade system. For the first time, Tanzanian exports were being settled in yuan Andrew P's, not US dollars. That move, small on paper, was a bomb in Washington's financial war room. If Tanzania could thrive outside the dollar, what would? Stop others? By the year's end, 7 African nations followed her lead. Economists in the US called it currency erosion. Africans called it freedom. Then came the moment that cemented her legend. In a televised interview, an American journalist asked, "Madam President, aren't you afraid of angering the United States?" Mwen leaned forward, eyes steady. "The United States has every right to defend its interests," she said softly. "So does Tanzania. The difference is, we were told not to." The clip went viral overnight. 10 million views in Africa, 1 billion hearts swelling with pride. By now, she wasn't just Tanzania's leader, she was Africa's voice. Her face appeared on magazine covers across the continent. Her speeches were studied in universities. Her economic reforms were debated in parliaments from Dakar to Harare. In Washington, she was labeled a populist threat. In Africa, she was hailed as the future. When she walked into the African Union summit for the second time, the applause lasted nearly 10 minutes. Leaders from across the continent rose to greet her. Some called her stubborn, others called her bold. But everyone, even her critics, agreed on one thing. Africa had found its Iron Lady again, not the one molded by foreign hands, but the one forged by fire, pressure, and purpose. And as President Asha Mwen stood before the African Union, her words carried not as rhetoric but as prophecy. "They will fear us not for our power, but for our unity." And when Africa finally stands tall, no one will ask who helped us, they will ask how they missed it. When President Asha Mwen nationalized the last American mining operation in Tanzania, the State Department called it a hostile act. When she refused to renew the U.S. Embassy's tax exemption deal, they called it undiplomatic. But when she announced that all Tanzanian oil, gas, and gold exports would now be priced and sold in Afrocoin, Africa's new digital currency backed by the BRICS alliance, Washington called it what it really was, a declaration of independence. The U.S. didn't say it publicly, of course. Official statements spoke of concerns over regional stability and foreign influence in Africa. But inside the Pentagon, inside Langley, and inside the Oval Office, the message was simple and chilling. Tanzania's president is out of control, and they were right. The panic in Washington at 6:45 a.m., the Situation Room filled. With noise, screens flashed headlines: Tanzania joins BRICS currency system, Asha Mwen rejects dollar for African trade, U.S. investors flee East Africa. National Security Advisor Henry Walsh slammed his fist on the table. "We can't let this spread," he barked. "If other African nations follow her lead, the dollar will bleed out across the continent." But even as he spoke, reports showed that Kenya, Uganda, and Ghana had already begun preliminary talks with Tanzania to join the Afrocoin payment network. "What's worse," added the CIA Africa desk chief, "she's inspiring the entire continent. Her approval ratings across Africa are higher than any sitting leader in the world. She's not just leading Tanzania, she's leading a movement." They all knew what that meant. For the first time in living memory, the U.S. couldn't control the African narrative. The President WHO wouldn't blink back and res salam. Mwen was unbothered. Her morning routine hadn't changed. She drank black coffee brewed from Tanzanian beans, listened to Kiswahili jazz, and reviewed reports on rising literacy and agricultural output. Her chief of staff entered, nervous. Madam President, Washington is threatening to suspend trade aid. They've canceled the investment conference. Mwen didn't look up. They call it aid, she said. We call it dependency. Then she smiled. Let them cancel. We'll host our own summit. And she did. Within 3 weeks, Dar es Salaam hosted the Pan-African Investment Forum, attended not by Western investors, but by representatives. From China, India, Turkey, Indonesia, and Brazil, billions in infrastructure deals were signed. Tanzania's economy, once dependent on Western aid, became the fastest growing in East Africa. CNN called her reckless. Africans called her revolutionary. The female force to the world, Mwen was an anomaly, a woman leading with the kind of resolve usually associated with generals. But to Tanzanians, she embodied a long-buried truth. Africa's strength had always been feminine. In the fishing villages of Lindi, women's cooperatives named new boats after her. In Arusha, young girls painted murals of her face on school walls. In Kampala, women's movements marched chanting her name. She had become a mirror reflecting everything Africa could be if it stopped apologizing for its power. They fear her, said South Africa's foreign minister during a private AU dinner, because she's the first African leader who can't be bought, bribed, or broken, and she wasn't alone anymore. Ethiopia, Ghana, and Angola all began revising their mining contracts. Nigeria announced new currency reforms inspired by Mwen's Afrosoin model. The Mwen Doctrine, as Western economists grudgingly called it, was spreading faster than any military alliance. The counterstrike Washington couldn't stand still. The U.S. Treasury imposed sanctions on several Tanzanian banks, claiming money laundering risks linked to BRICS funding. Western credit agencies downgraded Tanzania's rating overnight. Global media ran stories about authoritarian drift and growing corruption, but none of it stuck. Mwen's administration was spotless. Her ministers published their assets. Government budgets were public. For once, Africa's transparency exceeded the West's. So Washington shifted tactics. They began funding opposition groups, sponsoring think tanks that criticized her leadership, and pushing social media campaigns under hashtags like hashtag Tanzania in trouble and hashtag dictator Mwen. It didn't work. Every time they attacked her, her popularity grew. When they call me dangerous, she said at a rally, they mean I'm not obedient. The crowd of 200,000 roared so loudly the microphones shook, the economic shockwave. By mid-year, the numbers spoke louder than politics. Tanzania's GDP growth hit 10%, unemployment dropped to record lows. Rural electrification reached 90%. Meanwhile, U.S. corporations reported $40 billion in combined losses due to Africa's resource price reforms. In Wall Street boardrooms, executives whispered what no one dared to say publicly: Africa's breaking free. At the UN, Mwen delivered a speech that echoed through the world's institutions. You cannot lecture a continent whose minerals power your phones, whose oil drives your cars, and whose youth build your cities. We are not the problem. We are the foundation. Delegates rose to their feet in applause. Some Western diplomats refused to clap, but they couldn't deny the truth. The Iron Lady of Africa had arrived, and she wasn't asking for validation. The secret war behind closed doors, the tension reached boiling point. Leaked documents later revealed that Washington had considered covert measures to counter Tanzania's growing influence, among them cyber attacks on Afrosoin systems, media smear operations, and political destabilization efforts through NGOs. But the plan backfired spectacularly. Mwen's cyber command detected foreign intrusion attempts and traced them directly to American IP addresses. Instead of retaliating with aggression, she went public. In a live broadcast, she displayed the digital evidence and said, "If protecting our sovereignty makes us your enemy, then perhaps the friendship was never real." The room fell silent. For the first time, America had been called out not by a superpower, but by a woman leading a developing nation. The world gasped, Africa cheered. The legacy begins as months passed. Mwen's policies transformed the region. Tanzania's ports became major logistics hubs for African exports. The new East African power grid, funded jointly by BRICS and African investors, made blackouts a thing of the past. Youth unemployment fell by half, local manufacturing quadrupled, and women, for the first time in Tanzanian history, made up 60% of parliament. She had not just built an economy, she had built a movement. When asked what her greatest accomplishment was, Mwen didn't mention numbers or reforms. She said, simply, "We stopped waiting for permission." The world responds. Washington remained on edge. The CIA called her the most unpredictable leader in Africa since Nkrumah. The European Union tried to lure her back with trade incentives. But Mwen's eyes were fixed elsewhere on the Global South's awakening. She led talks to create the African Trade Security Council, a body designed to mediate internal conflicts without Western interference. She proposed an African infrastructure bank that would replace the IMF in continental funding, and when reporters asked her why she moved so fast, she replied with a line that now lives in history books, because Africa has wasted enough time waiting for approval from those who never approved of us living free. By the end of her third year in power, her image hung not just in Tanzanian offices but in African classrooms, on billboards, and even painted across shipping containers in Mombasa and Dakar. The West could call her radical, the world could call her bold, but to Africans, she was something else entirely: proof that leadership didn't have to kneel to be respected, proof that sovereignty could be feminine and fierce, proof that the continent long underestimated had just found its voice, and that voice spoke Kiswahili, not apology. By the time President Ashamwend entered her fourth year in power, her image was no longer just Tanzanian, it had become continental, almost mythic. She was the face of Africa's defiance, the embodiment of a new kind of power, one that didn't shout, didn't beg, and didn't bow. But with her rise came turbulence. The West's patience had run out. Washington, London, and Brussels had all come to the same grim conclusion. If they couldn't control her, they would isolate her. The pressure campaign, it began with a whisper, quiet leaks to Western media outlets. Articles accusing her of consolidating power, of stifling dissent, of cozying up to China. Headlines framed her as the female strongman, Beijing's darling, or Africa's new authoritarian. At first, Mwen ignored them. Tanzania's streets told a different story. Food prices were down, local production up, literacy at record highs. Women-led startups were booming across Dar es Salaam, Arusha, and Mwanza. The country's first electric bus plant opened, exporting vehicles to Kenya and Rwanda. Still, the attacks grew louder. Western NGOs began raising alarms about Tanzania's shrinking democratic space. Aid programs were suspended. The World Bank froze infrastructure loans. At a press conference, a Western journalist asked pointedly, "Madam President, how do you respond to accusations that your government has become too powerful?" Mwen smiled, calm, deliberate, devastating. "You confuse power with independence," she said. "For the first time, our decisions are made in Dar es Salaam, not in Washington, not in Paris, and not in London. That is not dictatorship, that is dignity." The clip went viral again. The global chessboard. By now, Mwen's alliances were deep and strategic. She had secured joint investments with China, India, and Indonesia to turn Tanzania into Africa's logistics heartland, a hub connecting the continent's north-south trade routes. Chinese engineers helped modernize the port of Bagamoyo, turning it into one of the largest in the world. Indian tech firms built digital corridors linking East Africa's universities into one shared online campus. When a BBC reporter accused her of selling out to Beijing, Mwen replied bluntly, "Selling out? No, buying in. For the first time, we are shareholders in our own future." Meanwhile, the BRICS bloc had officially invited Tanzania to join. That move, simple on paper, was a thunderclap across Washington. Pentagon analysts warned of strategic encirclement. The CIA circulated a confidential brief titled Mwen's Shadow: How Tanzania is Rewriting African Loyalty, and the White House, behind closed doors, gave a quiet order: contain her influence whatever it takes. The storm. Soon after, chaos struck. A mysterious cyber attack crippled Tanzania's national banking servers for 48 hours. Anonymous messages flooded social media, claiming corruption within the Mwen administration. Western news outlets ran coordinated stories quoting unnamed sources. For the first time, the Iron Lady looked tired. Her advisors urged her to stay silent to avoid confrontation. Instead, she called a live press conference. Standing before flashing cameras, she held up a printed intelligence report, proof that the cyber attacks had originated from servers in Virginia. "You cannot destabilize a people who have learned to stand tall," she said. "You can't threaten a nation that no longer fears hunger or poverty. We have survived slavery, colonization, and sanctions. What else can you take that we haven't already rebuilt?" Her voice rose with controlled fury. "Tanzania will not kneel. Africa will not kneel." The hall erupted in applause. Across the continent, her words were replayed on loop. "The woman who made the world listen." Mwen's defiance became a global headline. Protests broke out in Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa, not against their governments, but in solidarity with her. Students marched carrying placards reading "We are all Mwen." African influencers launched the hashtag #MamaTaifa, which trended for weeks. In a single week, 3 African leaders publicly echoed her stance. Ghana's president announced a review of all Western mining leases. Ethiopia signed a $3 billion port deal with China, and South Africa proposed a continental energy grid independent of Western financing. For Washington, it was a nightmare come true. This wasn't just a rebellion, it was a renaissance. The invitation, then came the move no one saw coming. Mwende announced the Pan-African Women's Leadership Summit, inviting female leaders, ministers, and activists from across Africa and Asia. The theme, Redefining Power. Held in Dodoma, the summit drew more global attention than the G7. Cameras rolled as Mwende addressed the audience. For too long, power has meant domination. For us, power means creation. We are not competing with men or nations, we are competing with our past. Thunderous applause filled the hall. They told us Africa was too poor to dream, she continued. But the world runs on African dreams, our minerals, our mines, our music. And if they call us radicals for demanding fair value, then let every African woman be a radical. The hall erupted into chants of Mama Tifa. Mama Tifa. From that moment, Mwende was no longer just a president. She was a symbol of a global movement, the intersection of gender, independence, and African rebirth, the breaking point. The U.S. retaliated by imposing a trade embargo on Tanzanian gold exports, citing human rights concerns. European banks froze credit lines for Tanzanian importers. But Mwende had anticipated everything. 2 years earlier, she had quietly created the East African Sovereign Reserve Fund, pooling foreign reserves from Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda. The fund acted as a lifeline, shielding them from currency shocks. When Western institutions withdrew, Mwende simply turned east, signing emergency supply deals with China, Saudi Arabia, and the Way. Within weeks, Tanzania's economy stabilized, the sanctions failed. For the first time, the world realized you couldn't punish a country that had already learned to stand on its own feet. The showdown. By her 5th year in office, Mwende addressed the United Nations General Assembly in New York. The hall was packed, Western delegates shifted uncomfortably as she walked to the podium, dressed in a crimson Tanzanian kitenge robe, head held high. You speak of freedom, she began, her voice calm and deliberate, yet your systems depend on our submission. You speak of democracy, yet you fund dictatorships when they serve your trade routes. A hush fell across the room. The African woman has carried the world on her back as labor, as mother, as resource. Today she stands to carry herself. The silence turned to murmurs. Some clapped, others stared, but every camera stayed on her. We do not seek enemies, we seek balance, we seek respect, and if respect cannot be given freely, we will earn it through unity. That night, global headlines screamed, Tanzanian president stuns the UN, the Iron Lady of Africa confronts the West, the transformation. Back home, Tanzania became the model for self-reliance. Every major city powered by renewable energy, free education nationwide, youth employment programs exporting African software engineers abroad, and at the center of it all President Asha Mwende. When a journalist asked her if she feared assassination or coups, she laughed softly. Fear is for those who doubt their purpose. My purpose is Africa. By then, even her critics had to admit the obvious. She had done what no African leader before her had achieved. She had made the West chase Africa, not the other way around. Her vision spread like wildfire, trade within Africa first, partnership with Asia second, negotiation with the West third. What began as one woman's rebellion had become the blueprint for an entire continent's future. The legacy years later, historians would call it the Mwende era, the decade Africa stopped being a resource and became a force. Her face appeared on murals across Nairobi, Johannesburg, Dakar, and Cairo. Her speeches were quoted in global summits. And her leadership became a case study at Harvard and Oxford, though, as one African student wrote on a classroom wall, you can't study a revolution you didn't see coming. Even Washington grudgingly began to adapt. New diplomats arrived in Africa with softer tones, humbler terms. Trade talks shifted from aid packages to partnership proposals. It wasn't fear that changed the world. It was respect turned through a woman's unwavering conviction that her continent's time had come. And as dawn rose over Dar es Salaam one morning, the Iron Lady stood at her palace balcony, gazing over a city alive with industry, laughter, and light. They said Africa needed saving, she whispered to herself, but all it needed was a chance to remember who it was.